Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Peter Riddle. I'm the Director of the Institute for Government. Welcome here. Sorry we've had a slight delay because Francis Maude's had to be in the Commons dealing with the debate. He'll be joining us, we hope, very soon. But there's, of course, an additional problem which you all experienced. We now have a Berlin Wall between us and Whitehall and Westminster, which is rather unfortunate at present, and will last for 3 months because of beach volleyball. We can attach whatever blame we want to. The preparations and of closing off the Mall and closing off the whole of St James's Park mean you've either got to go via the Trafalgar Square or via the Buckingham Palace, which is rather delaying things, but I'm very grateful you've surmounted or gone around the wall in that way. Now, this in a sense is a reprise of an event we held on the 5th of March when we published our open letter on civil service reform, and since then we've been engaged very much with Bob Kerslake and Jeremy Heywood and Francis Maude on these issues. And we produced about 10 days ago 7 tests to look at how we judge the plan, and then yesterday afternoon we produced our verdict on the new reform plan. And our general view on it all is positive. We believe the reform plan is a promising step forward. It's a kind of multitude of ideas in there. There's not one single one at all. There's a whole range of ideas which we believe offers the potential for achieving much needed improvements. In relation to the 7 tests, we believe the tone's right. Crucially, the 7 tests were devised and prepared by my colleague Peter Thomas. Crucially, we believe that the plan recognises that many civil servants don't work in Whitehall, and it addresses their concerns. It's also frank about some of the weaknesses and problems. It looks at the need for developing new skills. Also, there's a clear sense of direction, which we're particularly glad about. There's some very interesting ideas about how departments will change. Much greater emphasis on shared services, not only in back office services, but also in many other areas too. And this is, raises some very big questions about the nature of departments. And Michael Gove and the Department for Education are being very much not only described as pilots, experiments, perhaps if you're a Marxist you'd say vanguard, in looking. Also, it addresses the very difficult issues of accountability at ministerial and permanent secretary level, which have produced some tensions with the Public Accounts Committee. And I think there's some very interesting ideas there on the accountability of permanent secretaries, looking, for example, at the New Zealand experience of contracts for permanent secretaries and see how they work out, and also looks at other appointments I think what may well turn out to be many of the more controversial areas, looks at the appointments, the role of Secretary of State's in appointments, and also the ability to bring in non-political experts to serve as civil servants. We're also very interested in looking at how delivery models work and the opening up of policy making in a variety of ways. And we're quite pleased that some of the ideas the Institute's put forward are recognised in the plan. There's also a very strong emphasis on value for money and management information, and we very much welcome that. And the other crucial aspect of it, which came through yesterday in the Commons and has come through in the joint article which Bob Kerslake and Francis Maude did, was on also looking at it's a joint creation very much of the political and civil service side. In many respects this is unusual because civil service reform has tended to be very much from the civil servants, and that politicians have been less involved. We have an unusual Cabinet Office Minister now who's very committed and very involved in it all, and I think that's important. Of course, there remain questions. Classically, how's this going to be implemented? That's always been the problem with previous civil service reform plans, that the good intentions have been there, but where's the follow-through? And that's where I think the political involvement is so crucial. And there are ideas which we welcome, which indicate there will be that follow-through in the role of the new civil service leadership in carrying through this very clearly. There are also obviously questions on a number of the issues on accountability and also on appointments, which we want to see clarified. This is going to be a plan which is going to carry on for some time, but also fundamentally addressing what we regard as the big question, which is, it's absolutely clear there's going to be a much smaller civil service. How is it actually going to function in future? It's going to be up to a quarter smaller by 2015. How is such a civil service going to work? And that's a very big question indeed. And I think that our feeling is quite a positive one, that many of those issues are being addressed in the plan, but I say we perhaps, and this is John Vickers, described the response to the Vickers plan. He gave it 2.7 cheers. I think we're at 2.5, and depending on what's said tonight, rising. Now, I don't know whether you want to come in now, Bob, or shall we give Francis a minute or two?
I think we should kick off.
Okay, and then we can integrate Francis in there. Bob Kerslake, thank you.
Thank you for that, Peter. And I think the lesson of today, and I think it's the first day of the new arrangements, is get a bike, I think is what I've concluded, is it's going to be tough out there. The Civil Service plan starts on what I think is a really crucial point, actually, which is that the Civil Service itself plays a crucial part in British life, whether it's somebody's driving licence being renewed or it's policy on the Eurozone. What the Civil Service does has a huge impact on the quality of people's lives in this country. And that would be true generally, but it's particularly true now. We are, I think, in quite extraordinary times. Anatol Koletsky in the Times said that we're in a period, and he was talking about the financial crisis, where the impossible becomes the inevitable. I think you could apply that point more widely than the financial crisis. We're in a period where very big and dramatic challenges are faced by the country. And so, to put it simply, a lot rides on getting this plan right. My personal view is that we've got a good plan here. It's a good plan because it focuses on practical priorities. It has a clear set of actions that we can be measured against. It's relevant to all parts of the civil service, and we worked very hard to do this, whether it's the person issuing the driver's licence in Swansea or somebody involved in policy. We've tried to address the issues that face all of them. And lastly, and Peter referred to this, it is a plan that addresses the issues both for ministers and for civil servants themselves. In preparing the plan, we put a lot of effort into engaging senior and indeed junior civil servants to get their views on what the issues were. So this is a plan that is both aimed at ministerial priorities, but also aimed at the things that frustrate civil servants themselves. What about the proposals? Well, there are 18 priority actions within the plan, but I'd like to group them under three key themes. The first is a more unified single civil service. And that means more than just sharing of what I would call transactional services, payroll and so on, but actually embracing a sharing of what we do on talent development, performance management, capacity building, expert services such as digital and professional services, and indeed we've said we should look at policy making on a shared basis. This is important in terms of efficiency, which has been the primary driver of looking at unified approaches, but actually I think it goes a lot further than that. In a period where we're going to see quite dramatic reductions in the size of the civil service, we have to have a way of harnessing to best effect the expertise we have, and we have to have a way in which we can quickly achieve consistent performance in these areas that matches the best. And if you were to ask me what is the key thing we want to achieve here, it is to take the best performance in the civil service, and where that can be applied generally, apply it generally. Now, for those of you who've been connected to the civil service for a long time, you'll know that this is a pretty profound change, given that the civil service is operated in a very federal way. It's not made any easier by the fact that every department now is an individual employer, and it's pretty expensive and difficult to do much about that. So if we're going to achieve this model, it's going to require very strong corporate leadership, and I think actually a willingness to challenge what we mean by a department in government. But I don't think it needs to mean more central control or stifling innovation. And one of the things I did as part of preparing the plan was talk to some of the major corporate organisations, and many of them have made the distinction between things that make sense to be consistent and standardised, and those things where you give maximum power to the front line to make decisions. And let me just give a practical example of that I came across when I was visiting a job centre. One of the previous rules in the job centre was that you interviewed every 2 weeks somebody who was a claimant. You did that whether or not the interview actually was of any use whatsoever. What's now happened as part of freeing up the front line is that the frontline staff are given the ability to choose whether they see someone once every 2 weeks, or indeed once every week, or even twice or three times a week, and others they will see less often. The focus for the member of staff now is, can they get somebody into work? And the feedback from the staff when I spoke to them about that was really, really positive. But that doesn't mean that you can't achieve consistency around performance management, payroll systems, development of staff. So there is a contrast here. And I think the key to getting this right is to be corporate and consistent, where you can get benefits and free up staff to make their own individual decisions. The second theme for me, and again Peter touched on this, is a more open civil service. More open in the development of policy. Hi, Francis.
Hi. Excuse me. Thanks.
We already have some very open ways of developing policy, but the key principle of the plan is that an open policy-making approach will be the default. In other words, the case has to be made why you would do it differently. And we set out in some detail in the plan what we mean by open policy making, but it includes different approaches such as crowdsourcing, combined policy teams across Whitehall, open data, use of policy labs. All these are ways in which you engage those who are affected by policy more directly in the development of policy. And I think external sourcing, which has got a lot of coverage in the press, is just one part of an open policy-making approach. Put simply, Whitehall cannot assume it knows best, and it shouldn't have a monopoly on all policy-making. And I think actually that's something we can and should embrace within the civil service. The second principle in terms of openness is in the way we recruit and develop staff. What the plan says is that we should encourage more exchange with the private sector and with other parts of the public sector. It says we should draw on a wider range of backgrounds in promoting people to senior positions. So you shouldn't get to a senior position unless you've had some experience beyond one department and in operational as well as policy areas. And thirdly, more openness in terms of the way people get into senior positions. Less focus on grade, less focus on hierarchy, more focus on ability. And the third way in which the plan proposes more openness is a willingness to embrace different delivery models. Now, it's important to say the plan doesn't suggest mass outsourcing or anything like it. What it says is we should be prepared to test further examples of alternative delivery models, whether it's mutuals, joint ventures, or similar models. And I guess the point I would make here is it's not possible or reasonable for government to advocate to other public services that they should take an open approach to public service provision and not be willing to test it on itself. The third key theme for me is accountability, and the accountability issue goes at all levels in the civil service. At the most senior level, we've tried to get a much clearer sense of what the role of ministers is and what the role of senior officials is. And in particularly, to have clarity about accountability and where you sign off major projects and programmes. And that's part and parcel of, I think, the most serious effort yet to raise the game of the civil service in delivering big projects and programmes. And I think that's important in its own right, because it frankly wastes a lot of money if we don't do it. But it's crucially important to the reputation of the civil service. Nothing does more damage than poorly executed projects. But beyond the senior civil service, I think more accountability means we've got to have more robust performance management systems. And this again has had a lot of coverage in the press, and it isn't going after poor performers, it is having an honest, robust process that identifies where people have done well and recognises it and tackles poor performance. I don't think this needs to lead to more centralism or more risk aversion. I think it should create more professionalism and a sense of personal responsibility. I've talked about the three themes about what's in the plan. I thought it would be useful to say what isn't in the plan. Firstly, there's no proposal to change the constitutional settlement of an independent civil service serving the government of the day. Secondly, there's no major reorganisation proposed or assumed. It's for the Prime Minister to make decisions about the machinery of government changes, and this makes no assumption about that at all. And thirdly, given the press coverage, it makes no assumption about the size of the civil service. The size of the civil service should be what is needed to deliver government priorities. It's going to get smaller, we know this, but there's no assumption that it has to be a particular size or a particular shape. This is something that should be the most efficient possible to deliver government priorities. Since the plan's been published, I've had three key questions put to me about the plan. The first is, will it be delivered? And I guess this is going to be the key preoccupation of Francis and I in the next stage. And I think we can have some confidence about this for a number of reasons. First is, we will have a very clear and defined programme that will be publicly accessible. Secondly, there will be clear leadership at the top. We have a reform board that Francis chairs. There will be a civil service board already up and running that I chair. And each of the permanent secretaries will be part of delivery of the programme. Thirdly, there will be a dedicated team led by a DG, and it will be a key part of the personal responsibilities of the permanent secretary for the Cabinet Office. Fourthly, we will have a strong programme of communication engagement with staff. And fifthly, we'll have clear milestones for the delivery, and those will be transparent. So by July, we will have created the fund to pilot external sourcing of policy. By October, we would have completed the review of delivery models and put in place the new management information system. By the end of the year, we would have created new development programmes for future leaders at grade 5 and grade 7. By April 2013, we would have completed the new competency framework, and so on. We'll have very clear dates, very clear milestones that will be measured on. The second question that's come up is it radical enough? There has been no appetite by either the PM or the DPM to move beyond the current constitutional model. And that was a clear parameter set at the beginning of the reform plan. And secondly, there's a lot of change in this plan, but we need to remember that it sits alongside huge and radical change in departments themselves. So what we do in the reform plan has to complement and support that, not cut across it. And I think the third response to that point about radicalism is that there are some radical pilots, we might call it, in DFE, and we've agreed to look at the option of whether the New Zealand model will have something to offer. So within the plan, there are some specific things that are more radical than the core approach of the plan itself. And what I would say here is this is not the last word on reform. We'll need to return to it again in future years. It's what's the priorities to deliver now. And the last question, and this came out at a very busy and packed meeting I had of CLG staff this afternoon, is will it change the civil service we know and love, was the question. Well, the short answer is yes, but I don't think it will change the values. I don't think it will change the civil service as a good employer, and I don't think it will change the fact that the civil service provides interesting, varied work that makes a difference. So in all those ways, I think this will be the same civil service, but changed in the way it does its business and changed in the way that it has its culture works. So just let me finish really where I started. I think a huge amount rests on getting this right. We won't get it, and we don't get a lot of press coverage, but whether we do this right will make a big difference to the quality of people's lives in this country. For me, the external challenge from the ISG has been really, really valuable. And we recognise the response that they've given us in the 7 tests. And actually, I would share very much the analysis that they've produced here. I wanted to finish with 3 questions that are very much on our mind at the moment. The first is, what are the biggest barriers that people see to change for us in delivering this plan? What are the bumps in the road that we should be thinking about? Secondly, how do we create the right incentives for civil servants in a world of austerity and no bonuses, let's put it directly? Thirdly, how do we best draw in external ideas and thinking for what's likely to be in the next round of change beyond this civil service reform plan? I do think it's a strong plan. It's got backing at the senior level in the civil service, but also from ministers. The task now is to deliver it. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much indeed, Bob. I'll not in that. I think what we're going to do is Jeremy Heywood's going to speak next, then Francis Maude will wrap up. And also welcome, Francis.
Thank you very much, Peter. And thank you very much for this scorecard. First time I've ever had a personal rag rating. Sadly, it's green amber rather than just the straight green that we were hoping for. But maybe Bob, we can decide later who's green and who's amber. Anyway. But it's a very, very helpful piece of work, and the IFG's work throughout has been really helpful. I'm not going to repeat everything that Bob said, because I think that was really clear and very focused. I was just going to say a few things about how this feels from my perspective as Cabinet Secretary, particularly focusing on the importance of policy making and improving that. Again, Bob's touched on some of that, but I'll just go over, in my own words, some of the most important things in the document from a perspective of a policymaker. But before doing that, I just wanted to repeat a little bit, but more concisely, what I said last time we were here, just to give it some context, because I think that the size of the challenges, I mean, Bob's sort of set them out in Anatol Skaletsky's immortal words, but I think it's very important before we just get into the thicket of all this as to quite what a challenging environment we've got right now. So I'll spend just 2 or 3 minutes on that before getting into the policy stuff that I wanted to really major on. So the challenges are obviously familiar, but let's just go through them very quickly. First of all, since we last met, it's been confirmed that the economy is now back in recession. We've been flatlining as an economy for about 18 months now. And that's obviously, in most times, will be the main preoccupation of any government. In addition to that cyclical problem, we've got the structural economic problem facing the country, where 10%, maybe 15% smaller on a permanent basis as an economy than we thought we were going to be 5 years ago. So the cyclical problem, the structural problem, no wonder the government's spending a lot of its waking time thinking about how to revive the economy with a growth strategy. There are many different aspects to that. Now's not the time to go into them. But we've got that cyclical problem, and we've got that fundamental structural problem about the economy being much smaller, and a public sector that frankly hasn't adjusted to the fact that the economy is that much smaller on a permanent basis, unless, of course, we can get the trend rate of growth up to levels we haven't seen since the Second World War. So that economic challenge presents us with a sort of once-in-a-generation, once-in-2 generations probably, fiscal challenge, despite all the incredible dedication, hard work, innovation, and so on over the last 2 years, where we've found massive savings on an in-year basis. We've got £5 billion of cost cuts that the Cabinet Office under Francis has been leading. All departments are running the biggest change programs they've ever conceived of. We're probably only maybe 25% through the fiscal adjustment. That's a big adjustment because we had a big starting point, but we've got a massive amount still to do. So we're probably in a sort of year 2, year 3 of a 7, 8, maybe 10-year program. So that just gives you some size, some sense of the size of the fiscal and public service reform challenge facing pretty much every department in Whitehall. Then you've got the constitutional reform agenda. Having spent a lot of time in the last few weeks preparing the Prime Minister for Leveson, we're likely to have to face some proposals, well, we are going to face some proposals from Lord Justice Leveson's committee inquiry on the freedom of the press. Again, in normal times, that would be a sort of massive hot potato for any government to have landed in its lap. For us, it comes alongside House of Lords reform, which is going to be immensely problematic. You know, I see one or two peers in the audience, and I look forward to hearing their comments on that. But again, in any normal time, House of Lords reform would be probably the biggest thing the government was attempting in its parliament. For us, it goes alongside possible regulation of the press, a certain need to campaign to maintain the integrity of the United Kingdom, which is going to take a huge amount of time for the Cabinet Office, the Prime Minister, the Deputy Prime Minister, over the next 18 months, depending on when the referendum is. So whether you look at the economic challenge, the fiscal challenge, the public service challenge, the constitutional reform challenge, we are beset with enormous issues, and any one of those ones that I've mentioned would be the sort of dominant theme of most normal 5-year parliaments. We've got them all at the same time. We don't complain about that. For civil servants, it means it's an interesting time, but I think it's an important piece of context to what we've got to do here in terms of the civil service reform plan. Now, so what did that mean the task was with this document? Put simply, I think there were 4 things we had to do. First of all, I think we had to give some shape to the many different reform initiatives that were going along, some of them invented by an IFG process last year, which was really, really helpful. Many coming from the Minister for the Cabinet Office, Francis. Many again from the non-executive directors, John Brown's team of non-executives who come into government and given us some real expertise, but informed by now a genuine understanding of how government works. So we had lots of different strands. And Bob and I basically decided not to sort of come out with some great sort of 4P type thing. I'm not belittling Gus's thing at all. It was very great for its time. But the temptation would have been on sort of week 1 or week 2 of our tenure to come out with some slogans and some sort of high-level principles. But we wanted to take the time to work with our permanent secretary colleagues to try and give some shape to all of the different ideas that were kicking around and had been around and put them together in one coherent programme. And that's what we tried to do. Second, of course, we've got to play our big part in delivering savings. I won't go into that now. Bob's gone through some of the sort of key issues, but improving programme management, project management, better use of management information, all of these things are not just ends in themselves. They're some of the mechanisms by which we're going to meet these very demanding administrative cost savings. And thirdly, improving public services and improving the services we give to the public. Again, we're not doing all this for its own sake, we're doing it for a purpose, which is to make sure that as we cut our budgets and as departments shrink, we're still able to maintain and better still improve through digital, again, through better project management, through striking better deals with the private sector, through a whole range of techniques we'll come on to discuss, better outcomes for the public for the money that they give in their taxes. Fourthly, I think this is something I felt very strongly about, and I know Bob does too. We have to, I think, face the fact that this is such a demanding time. It is not unreasonable that people begin to question the whole fundamental model of the civil service. Every other part of the public sector is coming under huge scrutiny. So we have got to basically re-win for this generation of politicians and this generation of media the argument that this civil service, this model of the civil service, is the right model for the future. And we do that not by just asserting our right to continue the status quo, but by proving we can do all the things in this sort of reform programme. We don't have a monopoly of wisdom on policy making. We aren't good enough at project management right across the piece. We don't use management information well enough. We've got to address the weaknesses, resolve the inconsistencies of performance and outcomes, and prove that this basic model can be as efficient and as brilliant in its outcomes as any other model that people might care to put forward. As Bob says, the Prime Minister and the Deputy Prime Minister were very clear from the start. They didn't really want to change the model. That wasn't where they were coming from. There wasn't an ideological drift to this. But fundamentally, we've got to keep on. We can't be complacent. We've got to keep on convincing all our sceptics that this model of the civil service is the right model for Britain. It's endured for many, many decades, and I believe it will endure for many decades again. But it will only do so if we continue to modernise, keep up, and address our weaknesses. So turning on to the substance briefly, Bob's already gone through a number of issues which are really, really important, I think, for the quality of policy making as they are for the quality of operational management and everything else in the civil service. I would just pick out performance management. It's really important. Many civil servants have made this point themselves. It hasn't needed Francis to tell us this. We need to do this ourselves. We've got to be better at distinguishing our best performers and reward them properly, and our very poorest performers and give them a chance to improve. And if they can't improve, let's ask them to leave. We've got to be tough on poor performance. We've got to be flatter in our structures. We've got to be less hierarchical. We've got to be less focused on grades. We've got to allow people to the opportunity of applying for jobs if they think they've got the right skills, regardless of what grade they're in. I don't think it'll lead to a revolution, but I do think it's important that we emphasise that grades aren't the be-all and end-all. They never have been, but I think the signals that we send by continually talking in a gradist language, it gives the wrong impression sometimes. We're not as hierarchical as the organisational diagrams suggest, but people think we are, and I think there's definitely something there to address. We've mentioned management information. I won't go on about that, but that applies absolutely to the quality of policy making. Bob mentioned interchange. I think it's really, really important that we get the right balance here between allowing much easier interchange between the government, the public sector, and parts of the private sector and the third sector, academia and so on. It's still very unusual for the highest flyers to have a spell outside the civil service and then come back in fluently without losing status, without sort of seniority and so on. We're not good enough at that compared to where we should be. Equally, we don't want too much turnover. It was quite striking that a number of cabinet ministers raised the concern that people were moving too quickly out of jobs. That the Treasury have had this highly publicised sort of problem with a turnover rate of more than 20%. I mean, that leaves too young an organisation, frankly, with no corporate memory. And it can lead to a sort of tendency towards conservatism of advice, or alternatively, excessive challenging, because people aren't aware of the fact that the issues have been gone through many times before. So getting that right balance between sensible planned interchange and stopping excessive sort of churn, which loses corporate memory, really important. So some generic issues that the policy-making community in Whitehall, the civil service generally, will benefit from. But here are 6 other things that the plan has to say about policy that I just wanted to just tick off one by one. The first is this open policy-making concept. Bob's talked about it. I won't go into it in detail. It's set out very clearly in the plan. But it really is very important that we get across this point that even leaving aside the very small experiment we're going to do on contestable policy making, we want the whole default to be much more openness to outside ideas, outside evidence, best practice from overseas, and the whole culture has got to be, yes, we've got a Freedom of Information Act which gives protections to policy advice, but that policy advice, before it gets into a sort of the closed loop of the Minister Civil Service interchange at the end of the process, it has to have benefited from the best advice anywhere in the world that can be brought to bear on that problem. So a default of openness and a real responsibility to the Permanent Secretary to be the quality assurer of that policy advice. And that means as much focus on making sure the implementers of the policy, the marketers of the policy have had a chance to shape it as the people sitting behind the desk doing the actual policy making. Second point, 5 days training a year. Easy to write that down in a piece of in the report. It's going to be quite a formidable challenge. It's going to be quite a big commercial opportunity for the IFG, of course. But above all, it signals that we are absolutely determined that when people come into the civil service, they must carry on learning each of the years they're here. And what lies behind that is a view that there's so much innovation and good thinking and real quality going on in parts of the civil service that other civil servants never get to hear about. So I was really proud of the work that's been done over the last 2 years on the transparency agenda, on the nudge and behavioural insights agenda, on the payment by results models that are being developed right across Whitehall now, the work that we're doing on well-being. All of these things, little pockets of expertise are developing across Whitehall. Some of it stimulated by the Cabinet Office units, sometimes stimulated by special advisors. But people have taken the basic ideas from textbooks and whatever external stimuli and have really taken them on and implemented them. And we need to have a much better way of spreading that best practice across. And the best way I can think of, frankly, is to get pretty much everybody around the table 5 days a year learning what's going on. Sometimes it will be more specialist skills, commercial skills, but often, as far as policymakers are concerned, it's going to be about learning what other people in the civil service are doing with some of these new techniques. Third point I wanted just to underline was Bob's. Bob mentioned that we're not changing the machinery of government. We're leaving more or less the same number of, well, they are exactly the same number of departments in place, but behind those brass plates, we're going to do a lot more thinking about what services can be shared. And we're very keen that that also applies to policy as well as sort of back office services and very specialist services. So we've got one or two models that we were pointing to. The shareholder executive provides sort of corporate finance expertise essentially for any department that wants it. The behavioural insight team does the same with nudge techniques. But how can we broaden that concept? I mean, I don't think ministers will ever be comfortable with all of the policy advice they get being provided by a sort of central cabinet office pot, because everyone wants their own policy specialist to fight their corners and so on. But I'm sure we can go a lot further than we do now, and we're going to have to if we're going to cut the costs across Whitehall over the next decade without massively sort of reducing our effectiveness. The fourth area I wanted to flag up was the what works agenda. How do we take forward this insight that NICE in the health arena has been really helpful in ruling out certain non-cost-effective interventions so that the NHS can basically be clear which are the drugs, which are the procedures, which are the treatments that actually pass a value for money test or a cost-effectiveness test. How do we apply that basic model in social policy interventions, economic policy interventions, criminal justice policy interventions? We're starting this work. We've got very good engagement with people around, some of the people in this room, with the research councils, with Nesta and places like this. I think it's going to be a big agenda because, again, as we try and make ends meet within tight budgets, we've got to make sure we're spending money on things that the evidence suggests work. We're not wasting money on things which the evidence suggests don't work. But we're very, very agnostic at the moment as to how to do that. But I think it's one of the points made in your note, Peter, question marks about whether this will be done inside the Cabinet Office or whether it will be done at arm's length from government. My very clear presumption is that it will be done, to be credible, at arm's length from government. Fourth point, deregulation of the policy process. A lot of concern expressed by ministers and civil servants that the policy process has got bogged down with too many procedures, impact assessments, long periods when people have got to have 12-week consultations, things that just slow the process of policy making down. Now, a lot of those have been put in place to slow the policy making process down. So we do it in a more deliberate way. We don't over-regulate. We actually make sure that before we announce something, it's properly thought through. That's very sensible. But we need to do a very good piece of work just to work out whether there are bits of that process that can be stripped away so that if you want to introduce a deregulatory measure, you don't get bogged up for 8 weeks waiting for the regulatory committee to approve it. So there are things like, oh, you don't have impact assessments if there's no expected impact on anything. You're doing it for reasons other than impact on business, as it were. So a set of issues around that. And then the final point I'll make is, again, to come back to this DFE review, the Department for Education review. For those people who think we're not being radical enough, we've got Chris Wormald, the new Perm Sec there, and Michael Gove have been very keen to work together to explore more radical options in the context of DFE. Some people think they're in the vanguard. I think most of the people around the Permanent Secretary's table today thought they were the laggards because everybody else had already done one of these, and so that debate will continue. But certainly, for anybody who wants to argue that this reform programme isn't radical enough, there are plenty, as Bob said, plenty of reviews that we're going to do over the coming months and years that will allow that voice to be heard via a series of very dedicated reviews. So all in all, I think with Bob, this is a very good plan. It's very much a plan which the civil service as a whole feels comfortable with, feels engaged with. It reflects many of the concerns that civil servants themselves have expressed through a whole series of mechanisms. I profoundly believe we've got to implement it in a way that no previous plan has been implemented. So we're going to have to really build the capacity in the Cabinet Office to do that. And I believe at the end of that process, we'll have proved to this generation of ministers and to the media and commentariat at large that this civil service, in its current model, is worth keeping for the next period. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Jeremy, for that. Sometimes I'm asked when I do media appearances, aren't there totally different views expressed by the civil service leadership and political leadership? I said, well, come to the IFG. You come on the 5th of March, you've had the answer to that, and you come tonight, you hear the answer to that. Because anyone reading that plan, the plan which produced yesterday, knows it's a joint product. Front is Maude.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much, Peter. And just first of all, I mean, picking up that theme, I clearly agree with everything that Jeremy has just said, but I know I agree with the stuff that Bob said, even though I didn't hear all of it. Bob and I have worked so closely together and collaboratively in developing this program that we kind of almost finish each other's sentences now. We've talked so much about this. It's been a very, very fruitful process. I wanted to start with some general reflections about picking up the point that Jeremy was talking about the model, the fundamental model, because there is properly a debate about the two sort of broad models. One, ours of a permanent, impartial civil service, which has been the case for, well, certainly since Northcote Trevelyan, 150-something years ago, and what you might broadly call the American model, where administration comes in, top tier of appointments are changed, and, bluntly, there are arguments either way. There are advantages in both. The clear advantages of our system is continuity, institutional knowledge, a memory, a proper good memory, ease of transition. And we emphatically saw that 2 years ago when the coalition government was formed. Not only did it happen very quickly and effectively, but it happened with a completely new kind of government, which hadn't been formed in Britain following an election. I mean, where there have been coalitions before, they kind of formed between elections. And so it demonstrated vividly what the advantages are of this system. What are the advantages of the American model? I suppose it is that it would be argued that despite the dislocation you get with a new administration coming into place, which is very considerable, and the delay there is, once the new administration is in place and the top tier of posts are filled by what are always described as political appointments, but they're not all by any means political appointments. These are appointments made by the president, so who is kind of a political person. And the advantage is that you then it is argued, you are more likely to be able to get traction with the program and drive it through, because the kind of other side of the coin of permanence and continuity and collective long institutional memory could be said to be a resistance to change. Continuity is not the same as change, and governments come in, they want to change things. They got elected to do something different from their predecessors, and they're keen to get on with it, and they want to get traction, and they want to make things happen. I am a fervent advocate of the British model. I'm a strong defender of it. I think it can be very effective. It undoubtedly has the advantages, and I think it is perfectly capable of delivering what the American model is said to deliver, which is the political, the administration, as it were, the government getting traction and getting done what they want to have done. And I'll say perhaps a little bit more about that in a while. When we went through, I guess it was only actually a few days ago, seems to be a rather long week already, the civil service, the reform plan with the Cabinet Office Board, one of our non-execs said, he said, Francis, just describe in a thumbnail how the civil service will be different when all this gets implemented. And it was a great challenge, actually, because we hadn't quite done that. But I then did do it. It was and it read something, when I'd done it, it read something like this. It'll be smaller, obviously. It'll be flatter. It'll be faster. It'll be more digital. It'll be more capable. It'll be more unified and consistent across the piece. It'll be better informed with better management information. It'll be more accountable for implementation. It'll be more open. And this is really important, this last bit, it'll be less frustrating and more satisfying for civil servants to work for. And that's incredibly important, because one of the things that gives me a high level of confidence that this reform set of actions will get implemented effectively is that we are working with the grain. I said in the House when I outlined all this yesterday, and deeply, deeply believe it, that if reform of the civil service feels like it's being imposed on the civil service by ministers, it will not succeed. It will be water off the duck's back. The duck will continue to swim serenely along. And equally, if there's no political engagement and ministers aren't engaged at all, and the civil service is simply left spontaneously to reform and renew itself, then that won't work either. There has to be an absolute conjuncture of the two, and we've, I think, really and I'll say a word more about this, successfully achieved this. But the point is, this goes with the grain. This responds to the concerns repeatedly and trenchantly expressed by civil servants themselves in the people surveys that are now done consistently across the piece. It was a very good innovation that Gus O'Donnell brought in, that instead of having random staff surveys done in different bits of government, do one. It's cheaper and it's more consistent, and you can track progress much more better. It's one of those areas in which we do now have much better management information than we did. So it does actually go with the grain of what civil servants themselves want. And so I have a high degree of confidence that we can actually see these actions put into place and implemented. And it is now, at this time, I'm not going to go through all the detail. Bob and Jeremy have done some of that, and you know, you're an expert audience, and you've seen it all and read it all, and so no point in going through it all. It is now all about the implementation. What we've done has been a really good and productive process, and a lot of engagement between particularly myself, but other ministers as well, and Bob, particularly Bob, but also Jeremy and other permanent secretaries. There's been a lot of involvement by permanent secretaries. And, you know, the caricature would be you've got ministers on one side and civil servants on the other. And so it's a kind of wrangle between the two, and you sort out some sort of messy, fudgy compromise. And actually it hasn't really been like that at all. Because what we've done is work through what are the things that really matter, that will really make a difference, and actually had a really strong degree of agreement about some quite tough things in here. Not dramatic and not radical, not revolutionary, but actually tough, gritty things that will actually make a difference. In the first interviews I did after the statement in the House yesterday, the very first one said, the interviewer said, well, Minister, this is revolutionary, isn't it? To which the answer was no. And the next one said, well, this is pathetically timid, and this is a mouse, to which the answer also was no. It's serious, it's not upheaval, it's not the world turned upside down. It is within an existing good framework, but there are some real things that will make a difference. None of them will be dramatic in themselves, but if we do them all, and we must do them all, then it will amount to real change. And it is, as we've stressed, you know, this is not once and for all. There are no organisations in the world where every so often you do reform and then you finish and it's over and done with, and then we go back to steady state management. You know, all organisations are either getting better or they're getting worse. There is no such thing as going along on an even keel. And if we don't make all this happen and then build on it and go to the next stage and drive forward continuous improvement, then we will start to see regression, and that all of us want not to see happening. So it is all about the implementation. And I was just thinking back, actually, to the mid to late 1980s, where quite a serious set of changes was put through with the Next Steps report and the creation of executive agencies. And that came about, I think, like this, not as a result of a sort of high-flown, lots of rhetoric, visionary white paper about civil service reform. It was quite gritty and practical. And it was made to happen. And Robin Butler, who was head of the civil service at the time, oversaw the implementation of that. And it wasn't done overnight, but it was done in a steady, serious way. And it made a difference. It made a difference to the way in which public services delivered by central government were delivered. And it's that approach, not sort of high-flown. This is not kind of visionary stuff. Some of it's quite humdrum and practical, but actually make it all happen, make it all come about, and it will make a real difference. So I just wanted to touch then a little more on implementation and look at the RAG ratings, which sadly my version is a black and white version, so a little more. I might get either unduly optimistic or unduly pessimistic if I rely on that. But Peter's supplying me with a proper colour version. You know, it's part of austerity in the Cabinet Office, a ban on colour printing, or ban on colour printing for me anyway. I was sort of mildly encouraged by the report card. Number one, clear direction of travel, green, and I think that is justified. It does, I think, on number two, strategic issues, value for money, better policy making. Yes, and we get a good green on that, and that's good. Good tick. Then number three on the interdepartmental savings and expending review, amber red, and fair enough, actually, because this is not what this was intended to do. This is not a test that we sought to meet. Is it clear how, number four, how reform intent will be turned into actions? And again, amber red, and I think we are in a better place than that, but I don't think Bob or I would suggest that we're anything better than amber on that. There's a hell of a lot of work to do in actually turning this into specific steps, a critical path towards each of these things actually coming about. But that is something we need to address very, very quickly. Number five, I would say actually the dual leadership, Bob and Jeremy, I think it's working extremely well. I would give that a proper green, and I'm the one who sees it most closely. And I think it is a really good model that works. We get an amber on, is there the right political support? And I want to say a word about that. And I think this actually does understate it, because, you know, were there divergent views in Cabinet? I'd never come across a Cabinet meeting where there aren't divergent views. But what there isn't is any hesitation at all about making this happen. There is an absolute commitment, an absolute desire among every single member of the Cabinet and Minister to make this happen. Is there, in some places, some scepticism about it, whether it will happen? Possibly. And, you know, we will need to show the doubters that it can happen. Is it going to be crucial for ministers to put themselves behind it? Yes, absolutely, and they have and they will. But actually, you know, how many ministers are there? 100, less than that. And their priority is not reform of the civil service. Their priority is getting their programmes done, getting the traction that I talked about and getting the change implemented. And they depend on civil service reform happening, but they are not going to be the primary drivers of it. It will be the primary drivers of implementing the change have to be the leadership of the civil service, by which I don't just mean Bob and Jeremy. I mean the entire cadre of leadership, you know, right the way through the management structures. And, you know, I'm told that there are the top 200 in the civil service now numbers about 140. So, I mean, might need a new name at some stage. But it's that group, and it's the next 200 and the future 200, and it's those leadership groups all the way through. And one of the things I think we've set out in the plan is a much more corporate approach to recruiting the talent and building it and deploying it and developing it in a much more corporate way, all the way through from the fast stream graduate entry right the way through into not in a kind of impermeable way with a lot of movement in and out of that group, but really managing it much more corporately than has been done in the past. And it's among that sort of leadership and potential leadership group that success in making all of this happen will primarily depend. But as I say, the crucial part of it is that it goes with the grain of what civil servants themselves broadly want and talk about. And so number 7, are senior leaders in the civil service committed to leading the plan? Yes. I think we've seen very good engagement among permanent secretaries, but many others in delivering the plan, and now and there needs to be the same, and I'm sure there will be the same commitment to implementing it. So I think this is Now the key challenge is to make it happen. In no organisation of any kind is delivering this kind of change easy, and none of us kids ourselves that it is. The primary burden of leading this will fall on Bob as the head of the civil service, and I think the thing that gives me a great deal of confidence that this will work and should give others confidence is that Bob has a real track record of success as an implementer. I mean, he has led change in big, complex organisations, and he's made it happen. And that's absolutely crucial. And I know that he will put together a team, a strong, effective team, that are capable of making this happen. Because I think Jeremy is absolutely right when he says adherence to and continuation and support for the current model of a permanent impartial civil service does depend on it working. I mean, it absolutely depends on it working. And that means that, not only current ministers but future ministers need to be confident that what they decide should happen after seeking and hearing and listening to and considering proper advice and all of that, and after challenge about proper ways of implementing it, they need to be confident that what they decide will get implemented, will happen. And that's absolutely the key test for this. All of the things we've agreed and set out in here will contribute to raising that level of confidence and making it happen. But I was struck yesterday in the House of Commons that it was tended to be former ministers from the other side of the House who were slightly saying, why haven't you gone further? Why haven't you been more radical than this? And I think it's important, very important, that there was a very strong sort of sense of, across the political piece, across the political waterfront, that this direction of travel and these particular actions are strongly supported. So there's no division at all about that. There's no partisan difference about this nor should there be. But that's the test I think we've set ourselves. We've set ourselves a demanding challenge, and we now have to meet it. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Francis. We will be coming back on our colour coding later. And the key was to, in a sense, was exactly as you said, to our view, as I said before you came, we regard this as a promising plan, but of course implementation is a further test, and we'll come back to that in a year's time and look at what's been achieved and what's been achieved. If I just say, I was also struck yesterday by the cross-party support, more than one might have expected, and actually the ex-ministers were almost pushing you on, including some rather unlikely ones. Now we've got time for brief questions, so I know Jeremy's got to go on that. So could you say who you are? You're probably known to everyone, and what I'll do is group 2 or 3 together. Andrew. And there's a mic will be coming through.
Thanks. I'm Andrew Jackson. I've got one comment, if I may, in relation to the Next Steps report, which was when we did that back in the mists of time, 87, 88, that was one big, bold idea. Yeah. And actually, you've got 18 mid-sized ideas here, and there's a question about whether those will all coalesce and push forward. And then I've got 2 questions, which I hope are the same question. One is, if you just told permanent secretaries to get on with this and to get on with reforming their departments, and you didn't have this plan, what difference would there be? In other words, what value do you add by having a civil service reform plan as opposed to getting permanent secretaries to do it? And my second question, which I think is the same question, is what are the few things in here that will really make a difference? Because we all know that Whitehall is an absolute past master at implementing things perfectly, which make no difference at all.
Right. Jonathan.
Thanks. As your report card says, Peter, I mean, there's a welcome and frank admission that policy making is not consistently good enough. I wondered what your views are on any of the panel, in fact, on why that is, and in particular, to what extent it is a product not of the lack of openness of the system, but simply the incentives that senior civil servants face in terms of being able to talk back to ministers or to the process about what is or isn't likely to work, and what in here will actually change the incentives that the people who give policy advice have to temper their advice to what they think ministers, rightly or wrongly, they think ministers want to hear.
Right. Sue Street, the two behind.
Thank you. Sue Street. Just an exhortation, really. I strongly support this plan. Please do it fast. Just get on with it. When I was first appointed a permanent secretary, I went round all my serving colleagues and said, what's the big lesson I should learn? And they said, we all regret not having acted more briskly when we first arrived. And when I had been serving for about a year and someone came to me, I said exactly the same thing. Somehow the rats get at it, the capacity of the civil service to overthink and underdo could destroy all of this. So I urge you, even if it's rough and ready, even if you make some mistakes, get on with it.
Right, let's take Jeremy first. You don't have to respond to all, whichever one.
No, well, I'll probably just pick up Jonathan's point, I think, and leave Bob to handle the others. No, I mean, it's a fair point, Jonathan. Are the incentives going to be changed by this document? And I think the simple answer to that is no. I mean, changing the incentives is something we need to engage the media with, we need to engage Parliament with. We've got a very good discussion with our ministers on. But incentives to be overcautious, I think, rely upon more than just changing some words in a plan. I mean, that requires a change of mindset across the whole body politic. But I think there are things we can do by creating this presumption about being more open and being more open to other people's ideas. At the margin, experimenting with this idea of competition for the right to be the policy advisor, I think is important. I think there is something about keeping people up to date with new thinking by requiring them and removing the sort of stigma around going on training courses and so on, and actually creating much better spreading better information across the civil service from areas of good practice and so on. So there's plenty in here which, in my view, will drive up over time the quality of policy making. Will it change fundamentally the incentives faced by civil servants? Not dramatically in the short term, but frankly, I start from the presumption that most civil service advice is pretty good already. It's not consistently brilliant everywhere, so there's always room for improvement. But basically, we're building on something that's already very good and needs to be further enhanced over time.
Bob?
Yes, just to deal with the first question that came up. Could you just do this in departments? And I think I'm very clear that you can't, for a number of reasons, really. One is that I think the core to the change is how we achieve the kind of more unified civil service. And you can't do that individually in departments. It has to be done across government in a consistent way. And I think that's a key kind of principle of the model here. We've absolutely looked at things that kind of add to the change programs in departments and not duplicate them. And I genuinely think that that's what we've done here. And I think we'll learn a lot from that. You can't kind of do the thing about capability building and capacity building unless you look across the civil service. And as we get smaller, that's going to become more and more true, it seems to me. I think the second reason why you've got to do it across civil service is really hard to tackle some of these issues about kind of open policy making and openness in delivery in individual departments, similarly accountability, because they kind of happen well in one department where the relationship is right and don't happen in others. And you have to get the framework right, it seems to me. I mean, at Jonathan's point, part of Jonathan's point was, do civil servants have the confidence to push back and say, actually, that's not going to work? And I think the answer is in some departments they do, but it's not consistent, actually. And you have to have a model here that's true across the whole civil service, that it's part of the deal that you will, as a accounting officer, challenge on delivery. And put it another way around, if you don't challenge and it goes wrong, then you can't then escape your part, role in the process, I think. So I think you have to do this cross civil service. That's what the plan, the only way you can do these issues are across civil service. The second point, and Jeremy's dealt with the kind of, I hope, with the question that was raised around policy and consistency. But I think on the third point about fast, I absolutely agree that we want to get on with this and make an impact quickly, which is why we set some pretty tough timetable, tough milestones in here. It's quite interesting. I mentioned last time that I've gone on Twitter. I have to say the most interesting thing I've done was to put a picture of my new black Labrador on the Twitter, which has got a lot of hits. I've learned now how you get attractive responses. But more seriously, quite a few of the emails have been people emailing me saying, I was involved in previous reform changes and was totally frustrated, don't make it happen again. Yep. It's quite a salutary tale, that. So you're absolutely right, Sue, we have to get on with it. We have to mean it, really. And just one last part about, what's the most important to make a difference. I think actually all of them have an impact in their own way, but I think the most important thing are the three themes that I picked out there. The test of success is whether we've genuinely achieved those changes.
Francis, and can I add to Sue's question? When will we know when it's succeeded?
Well, I mean, there will never be a kind of perfect moment where all of this is done and we give ourselves a massive tick and everything is green and perfect. Because by the time because I don't think anyone claims that this is definitive. Not all of this will turn out to be exactly right. We think it's pretty good and we think it's directionally correct, but will all of this get done exactly as set out here? No. But Sue is absolutely right. I mean, if I can sort of summarize the approach, it's the JFDI approach to implementation, just to get on and do it, to put it in the polite version. And this is absolutely crucial. And as we do that, we'll find that not all of this is absolutely right, but we'll find out quickly and stop doing it, and then find out what is the right thing and pursue that. So absolutely, speed, pace, and you make the point, Peter, in the IFG response. Energy, urgency. It really needs to feel like that, and we need to invest it with that, and it needs to come through a kind of excitement and a real hunger for it. And going back to the point about the political, there is a real hunger among ministers to see this happen, and an impatience to see it happen. And we need to respond to that. And because I say, I mean, that if that hunger isn't satisfied with real progress, urgent progress, then the arguments in favour of changing the model become harder to resist. I mean, Jonathan's points about policy. I mean, I think the point isn't. I think Jeremy made this point. At its best, what happens in the civil service is brilliant. I mean, it's absolutely terrific. And the point we're making is not everything's terrible, everything needs to change, but actually it's too inconsistent. And actually, in project management, which everyone goes on about rightly, far too many projects don't deliver well, but actually the best deliver brilliantly. And there are some of the best project managers around in the civil service. Just we need to get all of it to a good level and then better. And just, I mean, in terms of why isn't all of the policy advice as good as the best? And I think the answer is we don't rely on evidence enough, and we're not rigorous enough with evidence and data, and we need to be better at that. I think too often policy advice tends to advance by assumption and argument and assertion, and we need to be a bit more rigorous in that respect. This thing about should officials sort of pander to ministers or temper their advice to ministers? Well, I think it's quite important to be clear about what the proper function is. I always get rather irritated by this phrase, speak truth unto power, as if sort of the tendency of power is always to want to ignore the truth. What you want, actually, is not sort of sanctimonious speaking truth, but actually you want challenge. You want intelligent, informed challenge. So actually you test what it is that you want to do against the best that there is, and don't do it unless you've satisfied yourself, because actually, again, it's, at the end of it, it's ministers who have to go on to the Today programme in the House of Commons and defend what happens, and you want to be confident before you embark on a policy, that it's actually going to work. And so it's that intelligent and forceful challenge, and the best ministers don't try and resist that. They like it and like to engage with it. So I think those are the key things, and certainly the ingredients of the best policy advice I've had in my various ministerial careers is when it's kind of hard-edged presentation of evidence and data, an understanding of what it is that ministers are trying to achieve, and not trying to frustrate what ministers are trying to achieve, but actually make sure that when they embark on it, they are doing it in a way that's capable of being implemented effectively and cost-effectively, and that's what good policy advice is about.
Right, we've got time for another quick round of questions. Andrew Cullen.
Thank you very much for that. Just following on from Bob saying he'd had a lot of people who'd previously been involved in reform initiatives, I don't think it's breaking cabinet secrets to say back in the early 90s, I was the principal private secretary of William Waldegrave. He was came out with a white paper. I recall vividly going around every single cabinet minister with William, trying to sell the white paper, and there was a huge amount of divergent opinion, huge challenge. So the idea that this cabinet or this government should all be signed up to exactly the same programme, I think is for the birds, and I see no reason why this thing shouldn't go forward. My question, however, is a different one. It's on interchange. You say you want more interchange, but the culture of the civil service is fundamentally against interchange. There is an idea within the government that if you leave, somehow or other you've betrayed your civil service ideals, and there isn't a really active attempt, it seems to me, to have a revolving door during a civil service career, and there isn't an active attempt to make sure that at the end of a civil service career you get civil servants going out and enriching the private sector. I wonder, have you any practical ideas about how you're going to encourage interchange to happen and change that culture?
Right. Gentleman over there.
Thank you. Mark Langdale. It's very striking in the paper just how much emphasis there is on achieving a profound cultural change. So intangible cultural change around a more dynamic, more open, more collaborative, less hierarchical civil service. And that's balanced with a huge amount of detail on tangible inputs that you're going to drive, and it'll keep a Cabinet Office Secretariat very busy, I'm sure, tracking those milestones. I wonder what gives you confidence, based possibly on previous reforms and your own analysis, on the relationship between all those tangible inputs and the intangible but profound cultural change you're going to try and effect. Why should we be confident that that will happen this time?
Right.
Thanks. Dermot Finch from Fishburn Hedges. I just wanted to ask how this all squares with localism and local government. Local government, you know, having more and more of a role in service delivery, and also seeing cuts at the same time. So, you know, a slightly different parallel but relevant. Does the panel have any views on, you know, how local government should be more open, more efficient, more interactive with the private sector in the same way that you think central civil servants should? Right.
And we got one more, Robert.
Robert Hazel, my question is a test of how open this bit of policy making has been, in particular, open to learning from best practice overseas. And it relates to two things that haven't been mentioned tonight: fixed-term contracts and allowing ministers more choice when making senior civil service appointments. I don't know whether these are in the plan, but everyone will know that they have been trailed in media commentary. And if you are thinking about these things, have you looked at Australia and New Zealand, where they've had fixed-term contracts since the 1980s, but in two very different ways? And if you have looked at those models, what have you learned from them?
Thank you. You can divide them up between you.
Right, let's deal with the practical question on how do we get more interchange. I think one of the things that Helen's here today, Helen Dudley, and I've been talking about, is actually do we change the model of how we kind of recruit into senior level posts. And historically, we've either chosen to do it internally or we've gone externally with headhunters. And often you find that you don't have enough, you have enough knowledge about the people coming back in, and safety first, you go for an internal. The question what we're therefore looking at is actually we have a presumption of posts being accessible, a general presumption, that's what you're going to do. And actually what you do is build up a network of people who are, if you like, connected, interested in potential people to come back into the civil service. And you draw on that actively when you want to bring people in. So I think part of the issue is that we just don't have the kind of networks. And actually we'd commission that from external people to do that. So that's one very practical way that when we come to recruit, we'll have a number of people who are much more known quantities and therefore much more able to make that move in to the civil service. And by having a presumption of open recruitment, somebody who goes out doesn't think that the door is going to be closed on them in the future coming back in. That's a key change for me as well. So I think there's some really practical things we can do about the way we recruit at the most senior level that will change the way the presumption works. I'll answer some of the other questions quickly. Just on there, it's more about local government. Actually, my personal view is that quite a lot of the cultural changes and changes of approach happened in local government a while back. To be frank about it, I think it's somewhat ironic, really, because they're often imposed by central government. But more corporate models of management happened probably 10 years ago in the best local government. The presumption of open recruitment happened 20 years ago. I mean, these are things that are embedded in the way the best of local government works. And I think, where does localism fit? I'm still a passionate localist. I still think that as part of any decision that government makes, it should ask the question, does it do it itself? Does it commission it from others? Alternately, does it localise it and devolve it for local decision making? That should just be part of the way things happen. And I think there's some genuine, powerful examples of how that has happened in this government, actually. Really big changes, actually, in that agenda. And that process hasn't finished. I think there's more to come. Where it creates a challenge, and we've done a lot of work on this, is how you connect that view of the world with a view of the world and accountability terms that says you should follow the pound. And we've had some interesting debates with the PAC on just that issue. So I think that's kind of, I think, a key point to make there. And the third question, let me just remind me what the third question was, Peter.
Cultural change.
Cultural change, yes. You're absolutely right. It's incredibly hard to measure cultural change. In fact, it's almost impossible. And because it's essentially about the way things work around here. And my experience in Sheffield was that it took 5-6 years to truly change the way the culture of that organisation worked. But you did it by a set of practical steps and by reinforcing the behaviours you wanted through the performance management of people. So when we performance manage, it won't just be about what you've achieved, but how you've achieved it as well. So I think these practical steps make an impact. And it's interesting, it's very hard to measure, but you kind of know when you got there, actually. It's quite interesting.
Jeremy?
Well, just to complete on the interchange point, I mean, I think this is, it's a fair challenge that we don't currently have the right systems in place. It's about the business appointment rules and how they inhibit people coming in and out, and how they penalise people by, refusing to allow them to do any work after they leave the civil service for a while. It's about the sort of tone that is set by permanent secretaries. It's about making sure that when people do go out on secondment, they come back and are clearly getting some recognition for the experience. So it's a whole series of quite practical signals, actually, I think, but as well some actual rule changes in the thicket of all this. And you've got to, of course, keep in mind sort of propriety issues and sort of, we don't want to encourage any perception of corruption as people coming in and out and benefiting from their inside knowledge and so on. So we don't need to be crazy about this. But it is quite a detailed set of work we're going to have to do to make this work. But I think we're all very sort of committed to that. Just on the culture thing, clearly it isn't going to come very quickly from a series of detailed, tangible changes. But don't underestimate some of the sort of signals we're sending in this document. And things like, for example, operational management, more permanent secretaries who come very much from an operational management background. we've said very clearly, this is something the PAC have picked up many, many times, we've got to leave people who are doing major projects longer in post, if necessary promoting them in post so that they don't miss out on those opportunities, because we mean what we say. I think the key thing is that we need to make sure that what actually happens in the next few months as a result of the commitments we're making, we seem to be sort of walking the talk, as it were. The thing that would be really damaging is if we say all these things and then when what people actually observe is rather inconsistent with what we say. And so I think quite a lot of these things in a subtle way will change the culture over a period of time, provided we sort of walk the talk.
So just one before I bring in Francis, which is the learning from overseas and the New Zealand-Australian experience.
Yeah, I think Francis may want to comment on this.
Okay, fine, Francis.
Sure. I mean, just to pick up a few of those, I was very interested in what Andrew Kahn said about the interchange and the culture being hostile to it. I think there's a whole lot of issues here. I mean, one is that these are very different working environments. And when people move from one to the other, it can feel like you've landed on another planet, actually moving in either direction, which is why the success rate of, as it were, avoiding tissue rejection is not that high. And one of the things we need to do as part of this, and this actually plays directly into your point about how do you make these inputs, you're quite right, turn into a different culture. I mean, if we succeed in doing the things I talked about, flatter, smaller, smaller's happening, but flatter, quicker, less hierarchical, all those things, there will be less of a sense that you're moving between planets and more chance of it working. But then we recruit into the civil service from outside in a way that would be unrecognisable in any other organisation. I mean, Jeremy and I were reflecting, we both at different stages of our careers and at different times, and indeed for different reasons, went to work for the same private sector organisation. And actually the process when you go and work for an investment bank is, I mean, you don't turn up to some sort of formal panel and be interviewed for 45 minutes and get sort of admitted or not admitted on the basis of it. I mean, you go through endless informal interviews, which is about working out, is it a fit? I mean, and do you fit it? Is there a need? And it's not just about working out, are you the right person and can you fit in and be effective in that organisation? It's also about trying to encourage you, trying to woo you. And we slightly sort of approach this, that coming to work at a senior level in the civil service is an enormous privilege and honour. And it can be and it should be very rewarding and satisfying, and it needs to be, frankly, because we are never going to pay at a rate which is competitive with equivalent in the private sector, nor, I believe, should we. But we need to make it appear attractive, and we don't always. And so the culture needs to feel much more kind of fungible. I mean, it needs to feel much more possible for people to migrate between the two. So you do get what Andrew described, much more of a readily revolving door to enable this to happen. I think that's really, really important. Point on localism, and do we have views about what local government should do? Well, no, actually, because that's what localism is about. And we think local government should have a view about that. And I remember before the election, sitting with a bunch of local government chief executives, and actually it was a leader of I'm sorry to say, a conservative leader of a council who happened to be there. He said, Francis, if you win the election, what do you want us in local government to do? To which my answer was, I want you to stop asking us what to do and ask your electors what you should do and feel accountable to your electors and your local residents, not to Whitehall. And I hope we are beginning to get to a point where that sense of local accountability and local democracy is very much more vivid and strong than it has been in the past. So what I expect to see in local government is a rich and varied pattern of different local, I mean, we're already seeing this actually, different local authorities finding different ways of making themselves effective and reforming themselves. And some will do it well and quickly, and some will do it badly and poorly. And that's localism. And just finally, Robert Hazel's point about appointments in the Australian-New Zealand model. The answer is we vaguely know about it, but we haven't gone deeply into it, but we do say in the plan that we particularly want to look at the New Zealand model, or where it's as we understand it, we don't want to do more work about it. It might actually be an early candidate for commissioning policy advice from outside. So prepare your pitches. But I think we want to understand that better. It's not for now, and it's not compatible with the legal model that we have. But I don't think anyone would say we could never go down that path. And the appointments point about whether Secretaries of State should have be able to choose between a choice of candidates for permanent secretary, obviously not kind of randomly off the street, but after the panel has properly gone through and assessed and ensured that the candidates are appointable and fill all the skill needs and attributes and are not remotely capable of being described as political appointments. All of that is essential. But I was very struck, actually, that when we were talking in the House of Commons yesterday, Jack Straw, extremely experienced and effective minister in the last government, said that on 3 occasions he was involved in the appointment of a permanent secretary in departments of which he was the ministerial head. And on each occasion he said, whatever the rules are, I want to see a choice of candidates, and that's the way it's going to be. And it's hard to see that any of those appointments went catastrophically wrong as a result, nor did it result in accusations of cronyism and favoritism and politicization that always accompany any suggestion that there might be any ministerial involvement. And I do think there's quite an important point here. The Constitutional Committee in the House of Lords is currently conducting an inquiry into accountability of the civil service to Parliament. And it's well known that Margaret Hodge, the chairman of the Public Accounts Committee, has advocated that civil servants, beyond just the accounting officer relationship, should be able to be called to give evidence to select committees. And the view we always take is that, well, we have a model of ministerial accountability. Ministers are accountable to Parliament for what their department does, and I think that's right. I don't always enjoy it, but it is right that we should do that. But then to say you do not have a choice over who is the principal instrument of how your department delivers seems unreasonable. And the relationship between the Secretary of State and the Permanent Secretary is the most important relationship that there is. And people tend to feel accountable, not just to the person who appoints them, but to the office that appoints them. And the sense that a Secretary of State has looked at a choice of candidates, approved and gone through all the mill of the process that there is, and decided that actually, with a proper assessment by the panel and the Commission, Civil Service Commission, that both of them are fit candidates to be permanent secretary, not just for that Secretary of State, but for future Secretaries of State, which is also the very proper concern in all of this. It makes a difference if the decision has been very explicitly that of the Secretary of State, and that intensifies the accountability and the feeling of accountability, which if we're to continue with and promote the model of ministerial accountability to Parliament for what a department does, that sense of very direct accountability of the Permanent Secretary to the Secretary of State is extremely important.
Francis, thank you very much indeed. Can I thank you? I mean, it's been a fascinating occasion, the second we've had in 3 months with all 3 of you here. And I think one of the great values is having all 3 of you here, and the perspectives you bring in different roles, the Cabinet Secretary, Head of the Home Civil Service, and Minister of the Cabinet Office, and the point of very activist Minister of the Cabinet Office involved in that. And as we've heard your thinking maturing at both meetings, and I found it very valuable this evening, seeing that, and you amplifying a lot of things in the plan. We at the Institute have been doing a lot of work on accountability. We're doing a big project, we're just about to launch on that. On the interchange point, we're hoping to have a series of seminars and events around the turn of the year, actually on this interchange issue, with the private sector, see how it can be worked out, looking at people, so quite interesting people working in government who have had experience with contrasting views. So we're going to be taking forward quite a lot of the ideas you've had. Also, in relation to the colour coding, my colleague, it was a debate which produced that colour coding, and it evolved from that. We'll be returning to this, and and you will certainly be having invitations for us to return on that. But could I, on behalf of everyone here, one or two silent people here who are current, and the more vocal have been the former, but on behalf of all of you, thank you very much for giving up the time. It's a very busy time for all of you. We really appreciate the Institute, and that we can be part of this continuing debate, which was one stage of. We all know implementation is the key. We'll be monitoring it. Thank you all very much indeed.